Good. Chapter 5. Remember what it was called? Back on this side of the door. Do you remember what happened in chapter 4? Remember Edmund met a lady who called herself the Queen of Narnia, but everyone else seems to call her the Wicked Witch. So let's find out what's going to happen, because now they got back into the house and now they can both tell their brother and sister all what happened. So let's see what happens. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy a while to find the others, but when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room, by the way, where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get through to from the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there in the woods. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's this all about, Ed?" said Peter. And now, well, now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Now, up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and kind of annoyed with Lucy for being right when he was wrong, but he hadn't made up his mind just what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference between them. And then he had a little sniggery laugh, and he said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success. And he went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her anyway? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But, well, it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whatever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her and one day and encouraging her the next?" "Well, I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "Yeah, you didn't think anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better having a row between the two of you. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and, well, I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts. Beasts." It was a very unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind, and so they stood in the passageway talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was, the next morning, they decided they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father, I guess, if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and he got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat quietly listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together, and he didn't interrupt till they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a time. He sat thinking, and then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" Oh, but," began Susan, and then she stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, Well, but Edmund said they had only been pretending. That's a point, said the professor, which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you'll excuse me for asking this question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the most reliable? I mean, which one is more truthful? Well, that's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I'd have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear, said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I would say the same as Peter, but we know this can't be true, all this about the woods and the fawn. Well, that is more than I know, said the professor, and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. Well, actually, we were afraid it mightn't be lying at all, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean, said the professor, like she's gone crazy. Oh, yeah, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she isn't going crazy. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She'd never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor is talking, and, well, she didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she's going crazy, or she's telling the truth. Now, you know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she isn't crazy. So for the moment then, and well, unless any further evidence turns up, we have to assume that she's telling the truth, don't we? Susan looked at him very hard, and, well, she was quite sure from the expression on his face that he wasn't making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir, said Peter. Why do you say that, asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go to the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that got to do with it, said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're real all the time. Oh, are they, said the professor. And Peter didn't know quite how to answer that. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was a few seconds, and she pretended to have been away for hours. Well, see, that is the very thing that makes her story likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you, by the way, that this is a very strange house, and, well, even I know very little about it. So if I say she had got into another world, I should not at all be surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, don't you think she would have hidden for a reasonable amount of time before she came out telling her story, instead of coming back instantly? But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor. And then he took off his spectacles, his glasses, and he began to polish them while he muttered to himself, I do wonder what they teach to them at these schools. So, well, but what are we to do? Asked Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point of the whole thing. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and, well, which is well worth trying. Oh, what's that? Said Susan. We might all just try to mind our own business, said he. And that was the end of their conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering her. and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that, well, people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it, to tour through the house. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in history books, and well, it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission. And Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children, and she did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew about the house. She had told Susan and Peter almost in the first morning when they came there, along with a good many other instructions, I'm sure. She said, "And please remember, you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house." Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought pretty much the same thing. And that was how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it all apart when the two girls rushed in the room and said, "Look out, here comes the Macready and a whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four of them took off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they had got out into the green room and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs, and so instead of up the front stairs as they had expected, and after that, well, whether it was that they lost their heads or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or maybe some magic in the house had come to life and was kind of chasing them into Narnia. But they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those tourists. Here, let's go into the wardrobe room and, well, until they've passed. No one will follow us into there." But the moment they were inside that room, they heard voices in the passageway just outside the door. And then someone started fumbling at the door. And then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else." And he flung open the wardrobe door, and all four of them bundled inside it and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but he didn't shut it, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. And that's the end of chapter 5. It's a pretty good story, isn't it? I told you you would like it. Okay, so make sure you come back tomorrow for chapter 6.